been said, and as my title shows up on screen here, I'm with Esri. Thank you for the call out in the last session, and thank you 4M for some beautiful mapping imagery to kind of set the stage for me a little bit, but we're going to go off in a little bit different direction. I'm here based out of Denver. Esri, if you don't know, we are the GIS leading company globally, been around for about 50 years. We're a multi-billion-dollar company, 5,000 employees, 3,000 partners, deploying GIS, geographic information systems, digital mapping all around the world for many, many industries. I focus on the architecture, engineering, and construction industry, which is definitely embracing and utilizing IoT at projects of all scale. I just want to show a few examples to just maybe put some ideas into your head, some imagery into your head, and then we'll, like I said, go through some introductions here. You know, IoT, as it pertains to infrastructure and smart cities, certainly applies to stages of planning, helping with safety and scheduling. This is an example of a firm based out of Canada, Pomerleau Construction, who embed IoT sensors into their vertical construction projects, into the concrete itself, to understand the curing state of that concrete so that they know exactly the temperature and the strength of the concrete, allowing them to very specifically schedule the steel erection, not doing it too soon, perhaps cracking the concrete, not wasting time waiting for the concrete to be cured when it already was. So here you're seeing a GIS dashboard comprised of CAD and building information model content. These dashboards are measuring not just the concrete strength, but also the environmental conditions. So IoT sensors during construction, helping the construction managers understand the health, the safety, the conditions of the construction so they can be most optimized during their planning stage. Another use of IoT, certainly for protecting both the assets as well as people. In this particular project that I'll show, this is one of my favorites. This is HNTB, construction managers, engineers, planners, a bridge in Norwalk, Connecticut called the New Walk Bridge. This is a model comprised of various file formats, various CAD and BIM applications. And see that little blue column in the lower left corner there? You'll see them again. That is the location of an IoT sensor on that bridge. So this is roughly an 80-year-old bridge that's being replaced by a new one. Right next to this old bridge is pile driving. So they've got IoT sensors on the bridge measuring environmental conditions, including the XY shift of the ground, the seismic situation of the ground as they're driving piles. So that as that work is happening, this old bridge potentially could be affected. It's a lift bridge with this mechanical room up top on both the north and south side. So those little blue columns there represent the value of seismic activity at any point in time. So the construction managers get warnings when their pile driving is potentially affecting the old bridge that could have dramatic situation causing it to fail. Another example of IoT sensors, it allows a larger group of stakeholders to have access to information than typically would be the case in engineering projects. In this case, it is a combination of GIS, satellite imagery, high quality, high fidelity visualization using a game engine, and these IoT sensors are showing the location of bus stops, the location of the buses themselves, population density, and this is based on real-time data coming into this game-like engine, showing you where buses are actually driving in a touchscreen kind of environment for the community to interact with, as well as to live and exist in a desktop environment. So IoT sensors delivering information about infrastructure to an entire community of people. And then finally, this last example is similar in nature. It's about monitoring. It's connecting data with context. This is the New York City, Manhattan bus system. This is a digital twin. I don't know if that term has been used here yet today. We might get into it. Showing the actual location of buses, the history of those bus maintenance, who is driving the bus at any given time, any breakdowns of that particular piece of equipment, all connected with sensors on the buses, fed back into a network of servers, delivering information in real time so that transportation planners and the community themselves can understand where these buses are, what's going on with them at any given time, maintenance history, and again, who might be driving them. And so with that, I'll stop my presentation and give a brief introduction to our panelists here. We've got Jay Decker, who's the Transportation Innovation Manager from the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure at Denver. And then Giles McCoy, Chief Innovation and Technology Officer more on the technology side, he says, than innovation from City of Golden. So good examples of a small city locally, a large city that we're in the middle of right now, with folks who focus on innovation, infrastructure, and IoT. And I'll just let you guys give a brief introduction of yourselves, and then maybe after your introduction, before you hand it off, Giles, to Jay, maybe just your definition of, or your description of IoT, Internet of Things, which may mean different things to different people in the audience here.
Sure. Everybody hear me okay? Well, first off, hi, everybody. Glad to see everyone here today. So, as you said, I'm Giles McCoy, Director of IT for the City of Golden. That's municipal speak. For the big world, I have a huge inflated title, Chief Innovation and Technology Officer. And what that means is that I'm responsible for all of the technology for the city. And if you're familiar with Golden, you know that it's a smaller town. It's not huge like my counterpart here. And the reason I mention that is, I think it leads to different ways that we look at IoT. And so as a definition of IoT, whether you know it or not, you all have tons of IoT running in your environments already. It's everywhere. It's pervasive. The term Internet of Things really refers to lots of little gadgets talking to lots of other little gadgets, and then all those little gadgets sending information back to a mothership of some kind so that you have information that is useful, right? In a SCADA environment, you might want to understand water flows or water levels or chemical composition, those kinds of things. And that's all IoT. If you're running streets, you'll want to know traffic patterns. You'll want to know how many cars stop and turn right. You'll want to understand pedestrian activities. And that's all measured with IoT sensors as well. The big take-home message from my point of view is, as you think of IoT in your environment, it's really important to understand what your goal is, right? IoT is a means to an end, and that end is understanding something, having information that you can use that's valuable and can change something in a positive way in your environment. So when you think of IoT, think about the solution that gives you the data to make good decisions about changes in your environment.
Wonderful.
Nope.
All right, even better. Hi, everyone. My name is Jay Decker. I manage our Office of Innovation at the City of Denver. So I specifically sit in our Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, since it has the biggest use case as far as putting actual technology and innovation out into the world. But I do work across all of our different city departments because it is a very diverse and big county that we manage. As far as IoT, I think Giles, went into it a perfect amount. But really to hammer that home, I think IoT is a really interesting concept. Technology has been around for a very long time, and we've used it in a variety of ways for decades. And it's really now that things are cheaper and can be more mass-produced, and now we have a fancy title like IoT. And so it shouldn't be something big and scary and new. It's been around forever. Cities have had cameras going back 30, 40 years that we could access in a traffic management system. It's just more sophistication. And really the idea behind cities and private companies to use this is it really boils down just to improving efficiency and improving safety at delivering services.
Great. I mean, yeah, good point that these technologies, these capabilities have been around for decades. The first time I heard the word SCADA as a information protocol was at least 15 years ago. The idea of putting cameras up and sensors indicating seismic activity or temperature in various infrastructure environments, certainly for decades. But yeah, we have tended to gravitate around the term IoT as a catch-all for that. You were kind of vague in how you're applying it now. I'd like each of you maybe to talk about the most interesting thing that you're doing as it relates to IoT. And we had a conversation last week where you brought up some things that felt very, very Colorado.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll point out is when you use the word interesting, that often translates out to really mean super painful and hard to deal with, right?
Sure.
So to keep it in the Colorado vein, in Golden, the most Colorado thing we're doing right now with IoT is, if you're familiar with the city, we have Clear Creek that runs right down the middle of town. And every weekend we have a large number of tubers that come to the city and avail themselves of Clear Creek, right? So the question is, how do you manage a resource like that? How do you know when it's safe? How do you know when it's not safe? How do you know where the people are going? How do you deal with parking? There are lots and lots of questions, and that is a project that we're working on, attempting to solve right now, right? How do we manage the creek? And one of the ways that we're looking at collecting the information that we need to make those decisions is using IoT, Internet of Things, lots of sensors, right? Um, when you approach a project like this, like I said before, it's really important to understand what you're solving for so that you can choose the correct technology. And some of these things will be experimental, and that's fine, right? I think it's fun to live out on the edge. Try and be a good steward of the money and get good information, but don't be shy to try new things, and that's what we're doing. So. We have traditional measures out there, cameras that can count people. One thing that we've discovered is that there is no camera company that has analytics specifically designed to count inner tubes. So, I mean, that might be shocking to you. What? No inner tube?
Sounds like a startup to form.
Exactly. So, I talked with a number of people out there, different companies that said, hey, can you count tubes with your cameras? And all of them said, well, no. And then everyone else then fell into one or two categories. They were like, we can do it, but you need to give us a huge amount of money, and we'll change the focus of our company to counting tubes as opposed to other things for X amount of time to build this for you. And then the other side said, well, we have new AI engines, and we can train our tool to do that. And the cost ranged anywhere from $80,000 to $250,000, $300,000. The point being, that you want to find the right tool to solve the right problem. And it might not be that cameras are the right solution. So we have, in addition to using cameras to count people, which they're really good at already, right? They can do that all day long. We want to count inner tubes. And without a camera solution that can do that, we are attempting a RFID solution where we slap stickers on the tubes, and we have RFID sensors along the creek that catch them as they come along, right? So we can use that data set in conjunction with the camera data set to come up with how many people are on the creek. And you might look at that from the point of view of how many inner tubes are on the creek or how many total people, but it gives us a data set that we can look at and then make decisions. Okay, you take this information along with creek flow and then understand what is the level of safety out there, and then you use all that information to make good decisions around how you manage access to the creek. So that's likely the most interesting. We do a lot of things that I consider to be a little more pedestrian, because they're on the ground. But that one is probably the one that's the most Colorado and out there.
And you didn't necessarily go into that problem with it needs to be IoT. It was you had a problem: safety, counting, making sure your resources
you need
were
a
there.
problem.
And IoT happens to solve that through RFIDs and perhaps computer vision.
Absolutely.
Jay, anything as interesting as that?
Well,
Interesting.
yeah, tough follow-up to figuring out tubing levels and how many people are doing
Exactly.
that. Very Colorado specific, and I'd be curious to dig into that data and figure out when rush hour is on a specific day.
When you get done, I want to talk about that for just a second.
That's hilarious. But to continue the theme for kind of Colorado specific things, I want to highlight two projects, one that's been well established for a few years and one that we are just kicking off that is very bleeding edge. And they are related to environment and bicycling, two things that are very important to folks in Denver and then the Mountain States in general. And so the first one is Denver's Love My Air campaign. So what it is many years ago, the city got a Bloomberg grant to actually create a hyper-local sensor, they call it the Canary, that can actually measure particulate matter in the environment around it at a hyper-local level. So it wasn't that long ago where an entire air quality sensor would be as big as this room, and you'd have one for the city. So you could say, hey, air quality is X, but that is incredibly different depending on where you're located, level of traffic by a road, whether you're by a manufacturing plant, whether you're by a street that has more trees. It's very different. And so we understood that as an area where we continuously have bad air quality, and then we add more wildfire smoke on top of that. It's very important. So we innovated and were able to build this canary that's roughly half the size of a shoebox. And we worked with over 35 public schools in the county of Denver. And we actually located these at each school, built an app, and built the website. You can actually go to it now. It's lovemyair.com. And you can actually see real time the air quality at each of those schools. And then we give those tools, not just because it's fun to know about, but because it's very important for younger people, folks at our schools that actually have any sort of asthma or any sort of breathing issues, that they can work with the teachers and principals to say, hey, it is poor air quality outside, literally 2 feet from here right now. Let's stay inside for recess. Or they use some of that information to understand what buses and teachers idling while dropping their kids off, to understand, like, hey, let's do a no idle zone, or let's have staggered drop off, stuff like that, to actually reduce it right where they're at, versus saying, like, what's the air quality at the airport? I'm nowhere near that, right? And so kind of very similar to weather, right? It's like the weather can be very dependent. It can be raining in Golden, and it can be perfectly sunny in Denver. It's really
And it
dependent.
always is.
Yeah, of course. My favorite is sunny rain, of course. So that one's been around for a while, really well established, and has been really successful. The other one I want to talk about is more on the bleeding edge side, and it's we're working with a company that has developed a digital twin and is calling it empathic data. So just quick raise of hands, who here has a smart device, like a smartwatch, a Garmin, an Apple Watch, a Fitbit, something like that? Probably about half of you, right? It's a growing trend. They're becoming cheaper, easier, more accessible to wear. And we are starting to lean into that space. It can be very hard for a city to put sensors everywhere across it. Takes a lot of time and money, and it's difficult to maintain and operate those. And so what we're doing right now is the city has grown its bike program from a $0 a year annual investment to a $250 million one. We actually just finished, I want to say it's like 140th miles of bike lanes in the last 5 years, and we're building many, many, many more in Denver. We're very fortunate to have good bike infrastructure and citizens that continuously support investment in that realm, because it's very important from an environmental standpoint. What we're really good at is building safe infrastructure. When we look at our engineering manuals and say, this type of road needs to have this type of protection and this color and be this wide and things like that. What we're not very good at, and what nobody is very good at, is, do people feel safe using them? And so it's very different. In the engineering world, it's called real safety versus perceived safety. And so the bike lane in front of me can be incredibly safe, but it doesn't mean I want to bike on it. It doesn't mean I want to take my wife or my kids or anything like that. And so it doesn't really matter how many of these we build if no one uses them. We're building them so people use them. And so what we're using, starting with the watch technology, is we're actually able to capture heart rate variability information. And so really what that translates into stress level. And so we've gotten around this in the past by having people fill out surveys and stuff like that, but that's hard to do and it's biased. This is your nervous system. It can't lie. And so when we have enough people to aggregate this information, we can say specifically, people felt really safe on this type of infrastructure. They didn't feel safe on this one. Or they felt pretty good until they got to this intersection and it was incredibly scary. And so we know, let's devote resources to this intersection instead of redoing the whole corridor, with the idea being that, yes, it's safe, but you need to feel safe to use it. And before now, it was just kind of asking people, but now we can actually tap into systems that actually record your health data and anonymize it, of course, and then target that to have infrastructure investments and improvements.
That's great. I mean, you hit on a bunch of things that hit home for me. I have a kid who's got asthma, and yeah, we're watching air quality on a regular basis. And as an avid biker, I can tell you, plenty of the improved trails feel safer now as they've gotten widened, more opened. But there's still plenty of room for improvement. So I don't mind my data being used for that purpose. But it does raise a topic. What risks, whether it might be security or cost or maybe even interoperability, what kind of risks come with your IoT investments? Giles, do you want to maybe start?
Sure. When you think of IoT, it's kind of a big
big word, right? And as far as risks go, there's all types of IT security risks with these devices. They have been compromised time over time, and you have to be very careful because they can be a conduit into your network. But assuming that you're able to eliminate that off the table and you secure things in a way that they need to be secured, I think architecturally, what you really want to think about is once you've figured out the problem, right? Okay, this is what I'm solving for. And then here's my sensor that'll give me the information that I need. You have to do something with that data, right? And if you have multiple types of sensors, these companies don't always work together. So you end up with these multiple data pools. So you really want to think about how do you deal with this big pool of data out there and mine that out and make it useful. So, I classify this as a kind of risk, meaning that you spend a lot of money, but things aren't really useful at the end, or they aren't as useful as they could be. So that's one thing that I would caution everyone as you're thinking about how do we build these systems that help us make good decisions. Make sure you think through the entire process, right? All the way from problem to solution, and then understanding what all that information is, how it can be used together to create that solution.
Yeah, well said. And I think our respective positions often are in conflict for risk. I want to innovate. I want to put out the latest and greatest out there that can, let us do our job the best. But I always get in fights with our technology services department because their main priority is securing the network. So they want to have a very long and thorough and comprehensive and safe vetting process for all of this infrastructure and technology to put out there, which I think is very important and very smart, but it really slows down the process, and it can also really limit the type of technology that you can use. And so really, what that means is that we try to end up being a little bit more risk adverse, maybe using technology that's a little bit more well established versus something that is a little bit more cutting edge. And I don't think there's necessarily a bad thing associated with that, but it does take much more thought. And so you need to actually be collaborative, have partnerships. Innovation happens at the speed of trust. And so making sure that if it's something that you do want to invest in, that you do think about it from soup to nuts to say, is it worth the investment here? Is all of this work getting us data that makes us more efficient on the back end, and getting through that aspect? Because frankly, I don't think we've seen it in Denver quite yet, but I've worked for cities that have been hacked. People have had to use their personal Gmail accounts instead of being able to use their government emails for 6 months while they sorted some of that stuff out. And it's something that the average person probably doesn't think about very much, but when it hits, it is absolutely catastrophic, and we need to avoid that as much as possible. But we still need to leverage this technology to do our job better. So it is finding that sweet spot between the two.
So maybe the other side of the coin, and maybe you answered this with my question about the most interesting thing that you're working on. What would be the greatest, and I'll use a term that actually was in the description of this particular session, the greatest community betterment? What is the greatest thing that you've done for the community? Or maybe it's a project you're in the midst of, maybe it's one you've already finished, as it relates to IoT. Could be tubing, could be transportation, could be the air sensing. I know that IoT is all over the place.
So my answer to this question is going to be not super sensational, right? The best thing that we do for our residents is to provide basic services that allow them to live their life in a really great way. And that's really making sure that we have fundamentals covered, right? As I mentioned before, IoT is core to all of your core systems, and that's everything from your water to fire department response, to police response, to traffic control, streets. So that's the thing that I'm most proud of that Golden does. The innovative, cool things like creek tubing and managing that's kind of the icing on the cake. But the most important thing is making sure that, people are safe in their homes, they're safe from crime, they're able to drive places in a timely fashion, they have water to drink, right? And those are the most important things that we can do. Now, once you've got that done, then let's get fancy and let's do cool stuff, right? And I like to be able to do that, but I always keep my eye on the basics, because without those, the rest of the things don't really matter so much. So not a really super flashy answer, but that's the most important thing that we can use IoT for, from my point of view, right? It's just
those core items.
So before jumping over to Jay, I want you to maybe just go another level deeper with that. How much of IoT data, for Golden at least, are you making available to the consumers? Can I go to a dashboard somewhere and see how many tubers there already are? Or can I go somewhere and see what the average response time is for emergency in my particular block of my neighborhood?
Sure. Yeah, and that's the challenge, right? So once you got all this data, how do you use it and how do you make it available to people? So for the tubing piece, that system is under development right now. The goal will be to have a dashboard on the city website so that when you are thinking, okay, I want to go to Golden, right? You can go to this dashboard and you'll be able to see in real time how many people have come through any of our different checkpoints, so to speak, right? Now, we're deciding, do we want to use actual numbers? Do we want to translate that number into some kind of rating, like a 1 to 5 rating, 5 being like, oh, it's super busy, it's going to be really slow, and 1 meaning, okay, there's really nobody here. So that information will just be out there all the time. You can go take a look as you wish. From like a PD and a fire response point of view, both our fire and police departments provide all that information out to the public, not in a real-time fashion, but more in an aggregate so people can understand what the different types of events there are in the city. So yes, all that is available. Now, from a traffic point of view, that's not so much published. That's really used more for internal decisions. Maybe there's something we could look at there, but that information really isn't going out in a dashboard that people can look and say, okay, the average speed here was this, and this many people turned right. That's kind of an internal mechanism.
Right, and I can find that information on Google or Waze.
Sure,
and
absolutely.
Maybe that information should be kept secure and private, like we talked about earlier. Jay, how about you, the community betterment side of things?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question, and I don't know if it's the one that has the most community benefit, but given the location that we're at, I think most people can resonate with it. If you live or work in downtown Denver, you've probably at least certainly been almost run over by one of those scooters at this point on the sidewalk.
Or run over somebody yourself.
Or yourself have run over somebody, right? Love them or hate them, people have a lot of opinions about them. And they just kind of showed up out of the blue a couple years ago in Denver. Yeah, they didn't ask for our permission. We had to haul them off, throw them away, things like that. But what we've really have found out over the last few years is that, man, people just love these things. We had nearly 5 million scooter trips last year. Just absolutely insane. They're moving more people on some roads than cars. And you may say that's crazy. Maybe they're just short trips. Maybe it's people leaving the bars. But really, when you look at it, it's all across Denver. It's generally all kinds of income stratifications. It's generally younger folks. But they are an important tool for us to change how people move around in Denver, get them out of their cars. Close to 30% of them will take the bus or the train and then get on the scooter or vice versa. So it's a multimodal aspect. But the biggest issue with these things is people ride them on the sidewalks. And that is supposed to be a very sacred, safe space for people to walk. And so we've tried a variety of things to try to get folks off of there. And this is where kind of technology has failed is with the GPS sensors on all of those scooters, they're not accurate enough downtown to say if you're in the street or you're in the sidewalk and to restrict that. We've tested it. It works in some areas like parks and things like that that are a little bit more wide open. But we've tried things as far as messaging, enforcement, ticketing, stuff like that. And what we're leaning into now is using that data to provide infrastructure. The theory is, of course, that people are riding on the sidewalks probably because they don't normally bike and all of that stuff, so they're nervous and they don't want to ride a small 2-wheeled Razor scooter that they had from their childhood out in a 3-lane busy road. I mean, that's scary, right? And so they're taking the risk to do it on the sidewalk and causing safety issues for other folks. And so one of the great things about those scooters is we know exactly where they're located and exactly where they're ridden and when. And we have a dashboard. We're working with a couple companies right now to look at that and say, what are the trends? Where are people riding? Where are the infrastructure changes that would be most impactful? And with the idea being that just this last year, we implemented 2 miles of bike lanes downtown that weren't necessarily on our list. It probably would have been 5+ years before we installed any sort of protected bike infrastructure on them. To say these are our 2 and 3 highest ridden streets. even though there's no bike lanes on here. So clearly people are riding on the sidewalk on here. Let's go ahead and experiment. Let's actually record the data to see how many people are on the sidewalk versus in the street. Let's put down a very nice protected bike lane in both directions, and then come back later this year to record information to see how many people are still on the sidewalk versus the bike lane, with the idea that we can start to test to see, hey, are they actually starting to ride in the street where they're supposed to when they feel safe? And if so, we'll be able to validate that with data, and then we'll be able to lean a little bit more into that GPS information, where to put future infrastructure, instead of a traditional approach, which is often it can fit here, or it kind of makes sense to put here. But now we have the ability to say, no, people are here. Let's shift it over a block, or let's do this one first instead of last. And so using that information in real time to make safety improvements.
That's great. So knowing where people are, knowing what they want to do, knowing what the problems are, and then IoT helps you solve that. So we're just about out of time. I got to do this one thing here. When I wanted to smile and wave, a little group selfie, proving that we were here having fun today. Awesome. All right. Thank you for your interest. Great responses to some softball questions. Appreciate the answers. Appreciate the time. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, everybody.